The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon. The particular kind of coastal rain that couldn't decide whether it was committed to the enterprise or simply going through the motions. Lyra stood at her apartment window and watched it work through the harbor lights with the detached appreciation of someone cataloging atmospheric phenomena, which was, technically, part of her job. 11 months. She had been on this planet for 11 months, embedded in the unremarkable geography of a mid-sized coastal city whose name she had learned to pronounce correctly only around month 3. The Ithori Council had selected it for precisely the qualities that made it forgettable. Not a capital, not a hub, not a place where anyone important was paying close attention. A place where a woman with long, tapered ears could wear her hair down and move through the world without generating the kind of attention that complicated observation. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of salt and aging timber, and the particular resigned warmth of a structure that had decided to be comfortable rather than impressive. She had furnished it with the minimum required to sustain a convincing human life, and had then, somewhere around month 4, begun acquiring things she simply liked. This had not been in the mission parameters. The mission parameters were very clear, and she had followed all of them except the ones that had crept up on her sideways. The knock at the door came just after 7. She opened it to find her neighbor from apartment 4C holding an umbrella that was not, to her knowledge, hers, with the expression of a man who had committed to a course of action and was now mildly uncertain about it. He was tall in a slightly unfinished way, as though he had grown quickly and not entirely kept up with himself, with the particular look of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors but had never once thought to be vain about it. "I think this might be yours," he said. "I found it by the mailboxes. It has a small pelican on the handle, and you seem like someone who would own a pelican umbrella." Lyra looked at the umbrella. She had, in fact, purchased it because of the pelican. "That is mine," she said. "Thank you." "Callum," he said. "Ward. We've passed each other approximately 40 times, and I realized last week I'd never actually introduced myself, which felt increasingly rude the longer I let it go." "Lyra," she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something. "Do you know anything about bioluminescent plankton? I've just come from a very long meeting about bioluminescent plankton, and I find I need to talk about it to someone who wasn't in the meeting, for balance." Lyra, who knew considerably more about bioluminescent plankton than any human marine biologist, opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. He stayed for 2 hours. They covered plankton, tide modeling, the particular cruelty of institutional funding cycles, and a television program about competitive baking that Callum described with the earnest analytical attention he apparently applied to everything. Lyra contributed more to the conversation than she intended to and found, at several points, that she had lost track of the part of her attention she usually kept in reserve. After he left, she sat down at her desk and opened her weekly report. She wrote for 40 minutes. The council required data, patterns, assessments of social infrastructure, and resource allocation. She produced all of these. She also produced, at the end, 2 paragraphs about the conversation that she did not submit, and then sat looking at them for a while before closing the file. Outside, the rain continued its ambivalent performance over the harbor. Lyra looked at the pelican umbrella by the door. She did not, she noted with the clinical precision she prided herself on, feel detached. The farmers' market on Tidal Street operated every Saturday from 7 in the morning until the vendors ran out of things or patience, whichever came first. Lyra had cataloged it in her 3rd week as a useful site for observing patterns of human social commerce. By month 8, she was going because she liked the bread from the second stall on the left and had developed a specific opinion about which vendor's coffee was worth the wait. Callum found her there on a Saturday in early autumn, standing in front of a display of preserved sea glass with the focused consideration she brought to most things, and fell into step beside her with the ease of someone who had stopped needing a reason. "You're evaluating the sea glass," he said. "I'm deciding," she said. "There's a difference." "Evaluating implies I might conclude it's not worth having. I've already decided I want it. Now I'm deciding which one." He considered this. That's actually a more honest description of how most decisions work than people usually admit. This was the quality in him that Lyra's translator handled adequately, but her own processing found unexpectedly difficult to categorize. The way he said true things in a tone that suggested they had simply occurred to him, without performance or agenda, as though honesty were a default setting rather than a choice. She had encountered very few humans who operated this way. She had encountered very few people of any species who operated this way. Her translator had been calibrated for language, but had developed an uncomfortable tendency to stumble on register, on the precise emotional frequency of a thing said. It rendered content accurately and atmosphere approximately, which meant that Lyra spent a great deal of their time together understanding perfectly what Callum said and working out separately what he meant by it. This was, she had noted privately, the most intellectually engaged she had been in 11 months of observation. They walked the market and then the harbor path in the unhurried way that had become the texture of their time together, not going anywhere in particular, not filling silence that didn't need filling. He talked about his current research with the enthusiasm of someone who had never learned to be embarrassed about caring about things. She asked questions that were more specific than a casual observer would ask, and he noticed this without remarking on it, which she had come to understand was his way of giving her room. "You're not from here originally," he said at one point. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "Somewhere far?" She looked at the water. The light was doing something particular to the surface of the harbor, a quality of late afternoon illumination that she had not encountered anywhere else and had stopped trying to describe in her reports because the council had no category for it. "Yes," she said. "Quite far." Callum nodded, watching the water with her. "I grew up 3 streets from here," he said. "Never entirely left. Some people think that's a failure of imagination." He paused. "I think some places just fit." Lyra's translator rendered this accurately. She understood it, this time, on the first pass. On the walk back, she found herself constructing, for the first time and without intending to, an image of what the next 11 months might look like. And then the 11 months after that. She filed her weekly report that evening. It was the shortest one she had written since arriving. The recall order arrived on a Wednesday at 6:14 in the morning, embedded in a routine council transmission that she had been expecting to contain scheduling updates and resource assessments. She read it twice, with the particular stillness of someone keeping their reaction somewhere their face couldn't reach it. The language was formal and not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been cold. The council acknowledged her service. It noted the exceptional quality of her observational record. It outlined, with the precision of people who had never doubted the outcome, what was required of her now: her assessment, her presence, her return to a life that had been waiting in her absence like a room kept exactly as she had left it. Her lineage made the request something closer to a requirement. The Ithori did not produce many members of the Royal Observation Corps. They produced fewer still who were qualified to do what Lyra was qualified to do. The council had been patient, which was its way of being generous, and patience had its architecture. It had a last room. She sat with the transmission for a long time. The previous evening, Callum had walked with her to the harbor overlook at the north end of the path. The one she had privately decided was the finest view in the city at that particular hour, and had told her something in the quiet, unannounced way he told true things, that he had stopped being able to imagine the city without her in it, and that he recognized this was an unusual thing to say but had decided the alternative, which was not saying it, was worse. Her translator had rendered every word with perfect accuracy. She had not needed it. She did not tell him about the recall. She told herself this was because she needed time to process the logistics, which was partially true. The fuller truth, which she examined with the uncomfortable honesty that 11 months in his company had made harder to avoid, was that she did not know yet what she was going to do, and she could not say goodbye to something she had not decided to leave. She began, methodically, to prepare. She reviewed the departure protocols. She identified the documents that would need to be filed, the cover identity that would need to be dissolved, the small accumulated evidence of a life that would need to be made to disappear. She did all of this with precision and without sleeping, and did not once look at the pelican umbrella by the door. On Thursday, she walked past Callum in the building hallway and told him she was busy with work. He said that was fine, with the gentleness of someone who knew it wasn't entirely true and had decided that was her business to share when she was ready. She went back to her apartment and sat in the silence and understood, with the clarity that comes from running out of ways to avoid something, that she was not going to be ready. That ready was not the word for what this was. The departure window was in 4 days. She did not sleep on Thursday either. She did not board the vessel. This is how it happened, at 5 a.m. On the morning of the departure window, Lyra put on her coat and walked to the harbor. Not to the private coordinates, where the Ithori retrieval craft was positioned beyond the breakwater, waiting with the patient certainty of a thing that has never been refused, to the overlook at the north end of the path. She stood there in the gray, early light and looked at the water and waited to feel certain. And what she felt instead was something that had no clean word in Ithori, and only an approximate one in the human language she had been speaking for 11 months, something like home, worn smooth by repetition until it had lost its edges and simply become the shape of things. The council's response, when it came, was neither swift nor gentle. She had expected neither. She had composed her transmission with care, in the formal register that her lineage required, and had stated her decision without apology, which was the only register she could manage and still mean it. The council would deliberate. There would be consequences she could not fully anticipate. Her status was a thing that would need to be resolved by people who resolved such things in rooms she was no longer in. She found Callum on Saturday at the farmer's market, at the second stall on the left, holding a coffee he hadn't paid for yet, and looking at the harbor with the expression of a man turning something over quietly. She had told him the night before. All of it, the mission, the council, the 11 months of observation, the years she had kept hidden in plain sight beneath her hair. She had told him in the straightforward, undecorated way that she had learned, in his company, was the only way that mattered. The silence that followed had lasted long enough to be frightening. Then he had said, "The plankton conversation, in month 1, you knew everything I was saying before I finished saying it." "Yes," she said, "and you let me explain it anyway." "You explained it very well." He had looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said, and then, because he was Callum, he had put the kettle on. At the market he handed her the coffee he'd been holding when she arrived. "I got this for you," he said. "I was going to bring it to your door, but I thought you might be here." "I'm always here on Saturdays," she said. "I know," he said. They walked the harbor path in the early morning light, unhurried in the way that had always been the texture of their time together. Her long ears caught the sound of the water before he did, and she had stopped hiding that weeks ago, and he had stopped pretending not to notice it with the particular grace of a man who understood that some things were offered slowly and received the same way. The stars were still faintly visible in the west, the sky not yet fully committed to morning. Lyra looked up at them with the complicated feeling of someone regarding a place they have chosen not to return to, not without grief, but without doubt. "Do you miss it?" Callum asked, following her gaze. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I miss certain things," she said, "the way distance looks from above, the particular silence of deep space." She paused. "But missing something and needing to return to it are different. I spent a long time confusing them." Callum nodded. He reached over and adjusted the collar of her coat against the morning wind, the small, unconscious gesture of someone who had stopped thinking about whether such things were permitted. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm very glad you stayed." "I know," she said. "That's most of why I did." The morning came in fully then, light spreading across the water in the way she had been watching for 11 months and had never successfully described in any report because some data resists reduction. She had stopped trying to reduce it. She stood at the harbor with the sound of the city waking around her and felt, without qualification and without the need to file it anywhere, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. It was, she had come to understand, the only kind of belonging that counted.